Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about the Horus Heresy, the most devastating, gut-wrenching civil war this galaxy has ever seen. This wasn't just a power struggle or some political fallout over conflicting visions of empire. No, this was betrayal on a cosmic scale, a moment when brother turned on brother, when the Emperor's own sons shattered everything he had built with fire, blood, and screaming madness. Even now, 10,000 years later, its scars haven't healed. The Imperium we know, paranoid, brutal, crumbling, is the twisted echo of what came before. And at the heart of it all, a son who dared to challenge a god who loved him too much to stop him until it was too late. The Horus Heresy isn't just history. It's the reason everything in Warhammer 40k is the way it is. Every ruined world, every corrupted legion, every act of fanaticism or repression, it all began with Horus. So, what was the Horus Heresy, really? Why did it happen? What did it cost? And why, after all this time, does it still burn so fiercely in the hearts of those who remember? Let's walk into the fire and find out. Before the galaxy tore itself apart, before names like Horus or Angron or even the Emperor became etched in blood and legend, there was a dream of unity, of purpose, of an age where humanity would rise beyond its fractured, barbaric state and take its rightful place among the stars. And for the briefest moment in its brutal history, it actually looked like that dream might come true. This was the Great Crusade. Not just a military campaign, but something that bordered on the mythic. Billions of lives were dedicated to this vision. A galaxy-spanning imperium, ruled not by squabbling kings or alien empires, but by one single undeniable force, the Emperor of mankind. Now, the Emperor wasn't just a leader. He was something far beyond what most humans could comprehend. A being of immense psychic power, intellect, and sheer will, forged in the fires of old Earth's darkest centuries. He saw humanity on the brink of extinction, scattered across a hostile galaxy, prey to Xenos, demons, and its own internal chaos. And instead of turning away, he decided to fix it. To unify Terra, to rebuild civilization, to purge superstition and fear and raise humanity into an age of logic, science, and strength. But he knew he couldn't do it alone, not entirely. So he created the Primarchs. The Primarchs were something else. You can think of them as demigods, or maybe more like incarnations of different aspects of the Emperor's will. They weren't just generals, they were symbols. Legends in the making. Each one was designed to be the perfect commander, suited for a specific type of warfare, leadership, or philosophy. But they were more than tools. They had personalities, flaws, loyalties. They laughed, they argued, they loved in their own way. And when they were finally reunited with the Emperor, one by one, it felt like destiny was snapping into place. Now here's where it gets interesting. Horus wasn't just another Primarch. He was the Primarch, the first to be found. The brightest, the boldest, the most beloved. If the Emperor had a favorite, it was Horus. And everyone knew it. You can read all the official records about the Luna Wolves' countless victories, how Horus reshaped entire campaigns with charisma alone, how he could turn a rival into a friend in the span of a single council. But it's the unofficial stuff, the feelings, the relationships, that really tell the story. He wasn't just a leader. He was a brother to the other Primarchs and a son to the Emperor in a way that went deeper than blood. That connection? It mattered. It defined everything that came after. Some fans say this was the first mistake, that the Emperor, for all his brilliance, shouldn't have shown that kind of affection to any one Primarch. That by elevating Horus so publicly, he unintentionally sowed envy and pressure in equal measure. Others argue it had to be Horus. That someone had to be the War Master, the one who carried the Emperor's authority while he returned to Terra to work on his mysterious secret project. And honestly, it's hard to say who's right. But what we do know is this: the early years of the Great Crusade were glorious. Worlds were being brought back into the fold, entire sectors reclaimed from anarchy or worse. The Legiones Astartes, each led by their Gene Father, were like a tidal wave of purpose and fire. The galaxy wasn't ready for them. Imagine what that must have felt like, to be alive in those times. To see the Primarchs not as myths, but as real, living beings. Walking legends who led from the front, who bled and burned and roared across the stars. They weren't perfect, and they weren't always united, but together they were unstoppable. People talk about the emperor like he was a god, and yeah, in a lot of ways he was, but it was the Primarchs who made the dream tangible. They turned theory into conquest, blueprints into bastions. Without them, the Great Crusade would have stalled before it ever left Segmentum Solar. There's something tragic in all of this. Knowing what comes next, it's almost painful to look back at the early days of the Imperium. The camaraderie, the victories, the shared sense of destiny. Because it almost worked. The puzzle was so close to being complete. Horus was at the height of his power, beloved by mortals and demigods alike. His brothers, even those who clashed with him, like Perturabo or Angron, still respected him. The emperor trusted him enough to leave the fate of the crusade in his hands. And for a time, Horus didn't just rise to the challenge, he soared. But that's what makes it all hurt so much more. The higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. And when Horus fell, he didn't just break, he shattered the galaxy with him. If you ask any Warhammer fan who Horus Lupercal was, you'll hear a dozen different tones in their voice. Admiration, bitterness, grief, even awe. Because before the title of War Master was poisoned, before he became the arch-traitor and shattered the Imperium from within, Horus was everything. He was the golden son, the perfect warrior, the one who shone brightest among the Emperor's children, and not just because he was first. Horus had presence. He had that rare kind of magnetism that made people follow him not out of duty, but because they wanted to, because they believed in him. From the moment the Emperor found Horus on the blasted world of Chthoniya, there was a spark between them. Maybe it was timing. Horus was the first Primarch to be recovered, and he spent years alone with the Emperor while the others were still lost across the stars. But even when the rest of the Primarchs were found, that bond never really faded. It was different with Horus. It wasn't just that he obeyed the Emperor. He understood him in a way few others could. Some say Horus reflected the Emperor's own ambitions, his charisma, his unmatched strategic brilliance. Others say the Emperor saw himself in Horus, and maybe that scared him more than he let on. And here's the thing. Horus wasn't just loved by the Emperor. His brothers loved him too. Well, most of them. He had this rare ability to unify, to build bridges, even where there were cracks. He wasn't as cold and calculated as Guilliman, or as wild and impulsive as Russ. He wasn't as withdrawn as Corax, or as damaged as Angron. Horus sat in this sweet spot where he could speak to warriors, scholars, statesmen, and make all of them feel like they mattered. He laughed with his brothers, bled with his legionaries, and led with a kind of fire that made you want to follow him into hell. And many did. His legion, the Luna Wolves, later renamed the Sons of Horus, adored him. And not in a cultish, fanatical way like the word-bearers worshipped Lorgar. No, this was different. Horus earned that loyalty through battle, through presence, through trust. He stood with his troops on the front lines, never asking them to do something he wouldn't do himself. His victories weren't just won by superior tactics, though he had plenty of those, but by sheer force of personality. The man could walk into a war zone and talk entire armies into surrendering before a shot was fired. There's this quote from one of his captains. When Horus spoke, the stars themselves listened. It sounds dramatic, sure, but it captures something real. Horus had that rare, dangerous kind of charm that could change the course of history. And it did. But at the time, it wasn't dangerous, it was inspiring. People believed he could do what the Emperor dreamed of, not just conquer the galaxy, but unite it. Not through fear or oppression, but through something higher, something that felt like purpose. Of course, not everyone agreed. There were tensions, even back then. Some of the other Primarchs bristled under his growing influence. Perturabo thought Horus was arrogant. Angron thought he was too polished, too soft. Even Rogal Dorn, ever the loyalist, had his doubts about just how much the Emperor favored one son above the rest. And you can't blame them. When the Emperor made Horus War Master, placing him above all other Primarchs as the supreme commander of the Great Crusade, it shifted the entire dynamic. It was a clear signal, this is the one I trust most. This is the one who will carry my vision forward. That kind of crown comes heavy. It breeds pressure, resentment, and eventually cracks. But still, if you read the old records, or even the scattered first-hand accounts from those who lived through it, you get this picture of a leader who truly believed. Horus wasn't playing politics. He didn't see himself as superior, at least not at first. He just believed in the mission. He believed in humanity's right to rule the stars, and more than anything, he believed in his father. That trust was absolute. And that's what makes his eventual fall so haunting. Because when someone like Horus breaks, it's not just a betrayal, it's a tragedy. Some fans argue that Horus was doomed the moment the Emperor made him War Master. That no single being, not even a Primarch, could shoulder the weight of the Imperium's future without breaking. Others think it wasn't fate or pressure, but subtle manipulation. That Horus was always a target for the gods of chaos, precisely because of his brilliance. The brightest flames cast the deepest shadows, after all. And Horus, more than any of his brothers, stood at the very edge of that fire. But at this point in the story, before the whispers, before the heresy, he was a hero, a brother, a son, the hope of the Imperium. And that's the version of Horus that lingers in the minds of those who remember what came before. Not the monster, not the traitor, but the man who could have led the galaxy into its greatest age. If only things had gone differently. For a long time, it really seemed like nothing could shake Horus. Not the horrors of war, not the politics between his brothers, not even the crushing weight of the title War Master. But when you dig a little deeper, you start to see the stress fractures, the little cracks that, with enough pressure, would one day split open into a chasm wide enough to drown the Imperium. And the first real wedge? It was the Emperor's silence. When the Emperor left the Great Crusade and returned to Terra, it hit Horus harder than anyone realized. Officially, the Emperor was pursuing a secret project, something so vital to humanity's future that he couldn't afford to be distracted by conquest. But he didn't explain it. He didn't tell Horus or any of the other Primarchs what he was doing. Just handed over the reins, gave Horus the title of War Master, and vanished behind the walls of the Imperial Palace. And for someone like Horus, someone who had fought, bled, and sacrificed everything in the name of his father's vision, that silence cut deep. He wouldn't have said it out loud, not then, but it stung. Because Horus didn't just want to be the Emperor's general, he wanted to be his partner, his equal. Not out of arrogance, not at first, but because he believed he had earned that trust. And when that trust wasn't returned, when the Emperor locked himself away and left Horus with nothing but vague orders and a crumbling crusade to hold together, something inside him began to shift. That sense of purpose he'd always carried started to feel like a burden, and the weight of the galaxy, suddenly, was his alone. It didn't help that the other Primarchs weren't all on board with Horus's authority. Some followed willingly, Fulgrim, Kurz, even Mortarion to an extent, but others bristled. Guilliman quietly resented how decisions were being made. Dorn questioned his judgment, and Lorgar, ever the snake in the garden, saw opportunity in the cracks. Horus wasn't blind to this. He saw the politics, the whispers, the unease among his brothers, and more he began to feel isolated. Not from his legion, they still adored him, but from the dream he'd once shared with the Emperor. One of the most subtle but tragic elements of this whole unraveling is just how human Horus's doubts were. He wasn't possessed, not yet. He wasn't raving about chaos or gods or rebellion. He was a son who felt abandoned, a general who felt overworked and underappreciated. And worst of all, he started to wonder, not just about himself, but about the Emperor's motives. Why was the Emperor so secretive? Why did he pull back at the height of the crusade? Why were mere mortals in robes, like Malkador the Sigillite, allowed into his inner circle, while the Primarchs were left in the dark? That's the part that really gnawed at Horus. The idea that the Emperor didn't trust them, that he saw the Primarchs as tools, not sons, that maybe, just maybe, they weren't part of the grand future at all. And it's not just Horus who struggled with this. Other Primarchs had their doubts too. Magnus was desperate to understand the Emperor's secrets. Perturabo hated being left out of strategic decisions. Even Alpharius and Omegon, with all their cryptic detachment, resented being kept at arm's length. The difference was, Horus had the power and the position to do something about it. And that's where the pride comes in. Horus was proud, yes, but not in the cartoonish, egotistical way people sometimes paint him. It was a pride rooted in duty. He believed he had carried the Imperium further than anyone else. that his decisions, his strategies had made the dream real. And when the emperor left, when the trust wasn't returned, it twisted that pride into something more brittle, more defensive. Horus began to question not just the emperor's trust, but his judgment. There's this haunting theory among fans that the emperor never truly understood his sons, that in creating them to be perfect weapons, he forgot they were still people, with souls and flaws and needs. And nowhere is that more obvious than with Horus. The emperor poured so much into him, the firstborn, the most trusted, but never gave him the one thing he needed most, a clear purpose, a sign that he was still part of the plan. And when that didn't come, Horus filled in the silence with suspicion. We look at the heresy now and think of demons and betrayal, of cataclysmic war and the end of empires. But really, it started with something as simple and as painful as a father leaving the room without saying goodbye. And for someone like Horus, who had stood at the center of the storm for so long, that absence was louder than any accusation. Even then, there was still time. The cracks could have been healed, the doubt could have faded, but the seeds were planted. And when the right voices began to whisper in his ear, voices promising answers, validation, truth, Horus listened, not because he wanted to betray the emperor, but because he wanted to understand why he felt so betrayed. If there's a single moment you can point to and say this is where everything changed, it's Davin. Not Terra, not Isstvan, not even the siege. No, the real breaking point, the soul-crushing, history-warping moment, was when Horus Lupercal lay dying on a cursed moon, and the gods reached down to offer him a hand wrapped in illusion, in temptation, in lies so beautiful they felt like truth. Davin was never meant to be significant. Just another wayward system, another battle in an endless campaign. But the planet had a kind of rot in it. There was an unease, a sense that something was wrong beneath the surface, like the galaxy itself was holding its breath. Horus led the assault personally, as he always did, and during the fight he was wounded, mortally. Not by a blade forged by mortals, but by a weapon tainted with warp energy, corrupted by dark forces we still don't fully understand. The anathema. That name sends chills down the spine of anyone who knows the lore. It wasn't just a knife, it was a symbol, a surgical tool of the gods. The wound should have killed him. Even a Primarch's gene-enhanced biology couldn't fight off the corruption spreading through his body. And in that moment of vulnerability, the trap was sprung. His closest advisors, and here's where the treachery cuts deep, some of the very people he trusted most, including Erebus of the Word-Bearers, orchestrated a desperate healing ritual. They took Horus to the Serpent Lodge, a place saturated with warp energy, and slipped his soul into the immaterium under the pretense of saving him. What they really did was hand him over. What happened to Horus inside the warp is one of the most surreal, controversial, and heavily debated episodes in the entire lore. Some say he was shown the future, not just visions, but realities, potential timelines where the emperor became a tyrant god, worshipped by a stagnant, theocratic imperium that spat on the ideals they'd once fought for. Others believe it was all deception, illusions crafted by the chaos gods to feed his insecurities and bitterness. Maybe it was both. Maybe the truth was buried so deeply in the lies that Horus couldn't tell the difference anymore. What's clear is this: the Horus who awoke from that healing was no longer the same man. He still wore the same face, still carried the same voice, but something had shifted. Not like a switch being flipped, but more like a glacier finally breaking after years of slow cracking. The doubts he'd been burying, the pride he'd been justifying, the pain he'd never voiced, all of it was brought to the surface and weaponized. The gods didn't just offer him power, they offered him validation. They told him his fears were right, that the emperor had lied to him, that he was nothing but a tool, a pawn in a scheme that didn't even include the Primarchs in the final vision. And when you hear that, when you imagine standing in Horus's place, wounded, betrayed, dying, and suddenly handed a narrative where you are the hero, where you have the right to reshape the galaxy, it's chilling, because you start to understand how he fell. It wasn't a mad, screaming descent into chaos. It was gentle, persuasive, almost comforting. The tragedy is that Horus believed he was making a conscious, rational choice. He didn't wake up and scream, "I serve chaos now." He saw himself as enlightened, as the one who finally understood the Emperor's betrayal. The gods didn't need to twist his mind. They just needed to reinforce what was already there. That quiet voice of doubt, now amplified to a roar. A lot of fans argue over how much agency Horus had in that moment. Was he brainwashed? Possessed? Tricked? I think it's more complicated than that. Horus wasn't a puppet. He made a choice. But it was a choice framed by manipulation, fear, and pride. He was shown a future of tyranny and decay, a future that, to be fair, did come true, and told that he could stop it. That if he acted now, if he turned against the Emperor, he could save humanity from that nightmare. And in that warped, desperate state, he believed them. It's also worth noting how eerily perfect the trap was. The anathema wound, the timing of the campaign, the presence of Erebus, it was all orchestrated with such precision that it's hard to believe it wasn't part of some vast, ancient plan. The Chaos Gods had been watching, waiting, and when the moment came, they struck with a kind of elegance that's more horrifying than any brute force. After Davin, Horus wasn't possessed, not in the classic sense. He was convinced that the Emperor had betrayed the dream, that the Imperium was already lost, that he, Horus Lupercal, had the strength to remake it in a better image. It's that conviction that made him so dangerous, because the scariest villains aren't the ones who know they're evil, it's the ones who believe they're right. That moment on Davin didn't just change Horus, it changed everything. The galaxy didn't realize it yet, but the fire had already started. The greatest civil war in human history had already begun, not with guns, not with fleets, but with a whisper in the warp and a dying man saying yes. The true horror of the Horus Heresy didn't start with massive fleets clashing in orbit or daemon legions pouring through the stars. It started with whispers and trust, with names once spoken with reverence suddenly turning to venom, with brothers standing side by side and then drawing blades. If Davin was the fall of Horus the man, then Isstvan was the fall of the dream. That was where the heresy went from shadowy conspiracy to open, bleeding reality. And it all started with a lie wrapped in loyalty. At first, no one knew what Horus was planning. On the surface, things looked the same. The sons of Horus were still executing the Great Crusade. Orders were still being issued. Wars still fought. But beneath that thin skin of order, something monstrous was growing. Horus began gathering those who shared his doubts, his bitterness, or just his ambition. And the names that joined him, they weren't the ones you might expect. Fulgrim, once the artist of perfection. Angron, the brutal storm of rage. Mortarion, cold and unyielding. And Kurz, the prophet of doom. All of them found reasons to turn. Some say they were manipulated. Others believe they were simply waiting for someone to break the silence first. But regardless of how or why they joined Horus, once they did, the axis of the Imperium started to tilt. These weren't fringe legions or outcasts. These were core players in the crusade, each with thousands of Astartes, fleets, weapons, and influence. And with them came the first real plan, a way to test loyalty and send a message to anyone who still thought the Emperor's vision could survive. The world they chose was Isstvan III. It was symbolic in a twisted way. A world that had once rebelled against the Imperium, but was now under its control. Horus ordered that it be cleansed of resistance, a standard compliance operation. Loyal Astartes were deployed to the surface, alongside traitors still pretending to be brothers. It was a coordinated effort, and no one suspected anything, until the virus bombs fell. There's a kind of stillness in that moment, in the horror of it. Thousands of loyal Astartes, men who had served beside Horus, trusted him, bled for him, were on the surface when the order was given. They were meant to die in silence, reduced to ash by a bioweapon designed to strip flesh from bone in seconds. But some survived. Not many, but enough to fight back. And that's when the facade shattered. The traitor legions landed, weapons drawn, and turned on their own. Luna wolves firing on Luna wolves. Emperor's children butchering their former brothers with smiles on their faces. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. And for fans, Isstvan III is one of the hardest moments to read about. Because it's not just the betrayal, it's the intimacy of it. These weren't enemies facing off across ideological lines. These were battle brothers, men who had fought shoulder to shoulder across hundreds of campaigns. And now, because of whispered promises and twisted visions, They were killing each other in the mud and fire of a world that should have been just another footnote in the crusade. The heresy had begun, not with a grand declaration, but with a knife in the back. And it only escalated from there. Isstvan V was the next step. And this one was even more calculated, more vicious. The drop site massacre. That phrase alone sends chills through anyone who knows the lore. Here, Horus and his allies baited the loyalists into a trap. Legions like the Raven Guard, the Salamanders, and the Iron Hands were sent to crush the rebellion before it spread. They thought they had the numbers. They thought they were among allies. But halfway through the battle, the second wave of Astartes, those meant to reinforce the front, turned their guns on the loyalists. The Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, the Word Bearers, all revealed their true allegiance in one devastating strike. It was slaughter. Pure, cold, planned annihilation. Ferrus Manus died on that field, betrayed by Fulgrim. Vulcan and Korax barely escaped with their lives. Thousands of Astartes were wiped out in minutes. And this is where the tragedy of the heresy really hits its stride. These weren't abstract political players or distant rulers. These were the greatest warriors humanity had ever produced, tearing each other apart because one man, Horus, believed he had been wronged, because he convinced others that the dream they'd been fighting for was a lie, and because, in their hearts, some of them had already given up on hope. What's haunting is how efficient it all was. Horus didn't just rebel, he prepared. He manipulated legions, sowed doubt, eliminated key loyalists before they even realized what was happening. By the time the truth came to light, it was already too late. The War Master wasn't just making a statement. He was burning the foundation of the Imperium down to the bones. Fans still argue about who could have seen it coming. Could the Emperor have stopped him earlier? Could the Loyalists have been better organized? Should Rogal Dorn have acted faster? But in the end, it doesn't matter. The first blood had been drawn. The lines were no longer philosophical. They were real, carved in fire and bone, and the galaxy would never be the same. Isstvan wasn't the climax. It wasn't even the midpoint. But it was the moment everyone realized the rules had changed, that the old world, the one built on unity, brotherhood, and shared vision, was dead. What came next was total war. But even amidst that chaos, some of the deepest wounds were already cut. Because betrayal doesn't heal easily. And when it comes from someone you called brother, it never really heals at all. After Isstvan, there was no more illusion. No more masks, no more half-truths. The heresy had torn off its veil, and the galaxy saw what it truly was, a civil war that spanned the stars, with brother pitted against brother, legion against legion, and entire worlds set ablaze for the sake of loyalty or vengeance. There wasn't time for reflection or grief or trying to understand how it all went so wrong. The Imperium was burning, and every side had to pick where they stood. The lines were drawn quickly, brutally. On one side stood the Loyalists, those who still believed in the Emperor's vision, however flawed it now seemed. Their ranks were filled with legions like the Ultramarines, the Blood Angels, the White Scars, and the Space Wolves. Their Primarchs fought not just to preserve the Imperium, but to hold on to some shred of what they once believed in. These weren't perfect warriors. They were angry, confused, and reeling from betrayal. But they refused to bow to Horus. And on the other side were the traitors, the sons of Horus, the Word Bearers, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, and the rest, each with their own reason for turning. Some followed Horus out of loyalty. Some because they hated the Emperor. Others simply wanted freedom, chaos, or revenge. And in many ways, the traitor legions evolved faster than anyone expected. They abandoned the old symbols of unity and began embracing something darker. Chaos wasn't a whispered name anymore. It was a banner. One of the first major clashes after Isstvan was at the world of Calth, a beautiful, prosperous Ultramar system that had once been a shining example of imperial order. The Word Bearers, led by Lorgar, had long simmered with resentment against the Ultramarines. Gilliman's cold pragmatism, his loyalty to the Emperor, his carefully structured realm of Ultramar, it all grated on Lorgar's wounded pride. And so Calth became a target, not just for tactical reasons, but for revenge. The Battle of Calth was devastating. It started with a false alliance, the Word Bearers arriving under the pretense of cooperation, only to launch a surprise attack that plunged the planet into chaos. The Ultramarines, caught off guard, were forced into brutal, close-quarters combat deep beneath the planet's surface. The fighting in the underworld of Calth was some of the most vicious in the entire heresy. Firestorms, radiation, tunnels filled with dead, it turned into a hellscape. Guilliman himself was wounded, and the psychic aftershock of what happened there had ripple effects that still echo in the warp. Calth wasn't just about killing Astartes. It was about breaking symbols, burning the idea that any corner of the Imperium was safe. And while the Ultramarines survived, barely, the scars of that battle shaped the rest of the war. Guilliman would go on to establish the Imperium Secundus, a backup empire of sorts, believing that Terra had already fallen. That tells you something. Even the most loyal of Primarchs had begun to lose hope. Other key worlds soon became battlegrounds. Prospero had already burned before the heresy fully ignited, a grim foreshadowing of the war to come. The burning of Prospero wasn't just a sanctioned purge, it was the start of the Imperium turning on its own in the name of order. Magnus the Red, shattered and betrayed, would eventually side with Horus, though his reasons were more tragic than ambitious. His fall wasn't rooted in pride, but in a desperate attempt to warn the Emperor and the punishment that followed. The world of Beta Garmon saw another massive engagement, a brutal meat grinder where Imperial and traitor forces clashed with titanic war engines, countless fleets, and unimaginable loss. These weren't symbolic battles anymore. These were about momentum. Positioning. Star systems being turned into slag simply because they stood between Terra and the Warmaster's march. And then there was Brodius, a lesser-known campaign, but one that fan communities still talk about for its intensity and scale. What made Brodius different was the sheer desperation on both sides. Loyalist forces, cut off and surrounded, managed to hold out for weeks against a siege that should have lasted days. They fought with everything they had, not for victory, but to slow the traitors down, to buy time, to prove, even in the face of annihilation, that the light of the Emperor still had defenders. And in the end, they were wiped out. But their sacrifice delayed the traitor fleets just long enough for the Loyalists to regroup elsewhere. In this war, even defeat could be a kind of victory. One of the things that makes this phase of the heresy so painful is how many good men died still not fully understanding what they were fighting for. Many Astartes didn't know the full scale of the betrayal. They just followed orders. They saw old allies become enemies overnight and had to make choices that tore them apart inside. There are stories of entire companies splitting, squads turning on each other mid-battle, and in some cases, brothers simply laying down their weapons, unable to fight their kin. For fans, this is the part of the heresy that feels the most raw. It's not just about chaos versus the Imperium, it's about trust shattering, about legions unraveling, about sons trying to kill their father's dream before it killed them first. The galaxy wasn't being carved neatly into good and evil. It was being smeared with pain, with confusion, with fury. And through it all, Horus was pushing forward, always forward, reshaping the very idea of war, of loyalty, of destiny. This was no longer a crusade. It was a reckoning. And with every world that burned, with every Primarch that fell deeper into madness or despair, the question stopped being whether the Imperium could survive, and became whether anything worth saving would remain at all. There's something uniquely tragic about the traitor legions. Not just that they turned, but how they changed after they did. These weren't just soldiers who switched sides. They were once heroes, icons, the pride of the Emperor's war machine. And then, little by little, they became something else entirely. Their armor twisted, their minds fractured, their purpose rotted from the inside out. What emerged from that transformation wasn't just a new enemy. It was a mockery of what they used to be. The process wasn't immediate. At first, the changes were subtle. A shift in iconography, a darker tone in their speech, new rituals whispered behind closed doors. But over time, the corruption seeped in like poison through a wound. And it wasn't just physical, though the mutations came soon enough. The real damage was spiritual, because when a legion gives itself to chaos, it doesn't just adopt a new god. It breaks something fundamental inside. It rewrites identity, purpose, even memory. You stop fighting for something, and start existing because something darker now sustains you. Look at the Emperor's children. Once paragons of discipline, martial perfection, and artful combat, Fulgrim led them with elegance, obsessed with refinement and beauty. But that obsession turned toxic. Perfection became addiction. Discipline became decadence. Slaanesh offered them sensations beyond mortal comprehension. Sounds, sights, feelings so intense that reality itself began to feel dull by comparison. And they dove into it. They mutilated themselves in pursuit of aesthetic highs, modified their own bodies with sonic weapons and nerve amplifiers. Some of them don't even have faces anymore, just smooth, twitching surfaces that pulse with sensation. You can't help but wonder, did they even notice the shift when it happened? Or did they mistake the rot for evolution? Then there's the Death Guard. Mortarion never trusted the Emperor. He always saw him as a tyrant hiding behind a mask of nobility. But even Mortarion never imagined the fate that awaited him. After giving in to Nurgle, the Death Guard stopped being warriors and became vessels, shambling monstrosities bloated with disease, immune to pain, spreading decay wherever they marched. Their once pristine armor is now rusted, pitted, alive with flies and tumors. And yet, they smile. That's the horror of it. Nurgle's gifts don't just corrupt the body, they twist perception. Suffering becomes comfort, rot becomes joy. It's not mind control, it's worse. It's contentment and damnation. The World Eaters are another kind of nightmare. Angron was already on the edge before the heresy began. Broken by slavery, implanted with the butcher's nails that drove him into berserker rages. But once Khorne took hold, there was no restraint left. The World Eaters became avatars of violence. They don't fight to win anymore. They fight to feel, to kill, to drown in the madness of bloodlust. And the worst part? Some of them don't even have language anymore. Just growls, screams, howls of endless fury. Once they were warriors. Now they're storms of hatred in red armor, and there's no strategy left, only slaughter. But not every transformation was so overt. The Alpha Legion, for example, remains an enigma. They serve chaos, supposedly, but their motivations are so layered in misdirection and shadow that some fans still argue they're loyal at heart. The old theory that they turned traitor on purpose to infiltrate chaos and ultimately protect the Imperium is still alive. But if that's true, it's a dark kind of loyalty, one that involves letting billions die to serve a plan no one understands. Whether they mutated physically is up for debate. They're so secretive that even their appearance is a mystery. But mentally, there's no question. They became something colder, detached, less human. And then there are the Thousand Sons, arguably the most heartbreaking of all. They didn't want war. Magnus just wanted knowledge, truth, the power to understand and protect. But after Prospero burned, after his warnings were ignored, he gave in to Tzeentch. The change came like a tidal wave. Sorcery replaced science. Arcane rituals replaced reason. And eventually, the Legion fractured under the weight of its own power. Most of the Thousand Sons are dust now, literally. Souls trapped inside armor, held together only by sorcery. Once, they were scholars. Now they're echoes. Beautiful, tragic echoes. Fans often argue about whether the traitor legions had a choice. Were they corrupted beyond their will, or did they want what chaos offered? I think the truth is somewhere in between. Chaos doesn't force you, it tempts you with the very things you already desire. Perfection, strength, freedom, revenge, immortality. And once you say yes, even once, it wraps those desires around your throat like a chain. Every legion that fell did so because they were offered a version of themselves that felt more true than the roles the Emperor assigned them. And in pursuing that self, they lost everything. What's left now isn't just enemy factions. It's twisted reflections of what could have been. Each Chaos Legion shows us a future where strength becomes tyranny, passion becomes obsession, resilience becomes decay. They aren't villains in the cartoon sense. They're warnings. Proof that even the greatest heroes given the wrong push at the wrong time can become monsters, not because they were weak, but because they were too strong in the wrong direction. The Imperium calls them traitors. And yeah, they are, but they're also victims of bad faith, of neglect, of ambition unchecked. Their fall wasn't a single step, it was a spiral. One dark choice after another, until they didn't even remember who they used to be. And maybe, in some deep, twisted part of them, they still don't understand what they've become. Or maybe they do. and they've just stopped caring. When people talk about the siege of Terra, they often focus on the big moments: the fall of the walls, the duel between Horus and the Emperor, the death of Sanguinius. And yeah, those moments were legendary, pivotal. But what really gets me about the siege is just how inevitable it all felt. Like the whole galaxy had been spiraling toward this one final collision. The war had raged across 1,000,000 worlds, but it was always going to end here. On Terra, at the heart of everything, where it had all begun. The planet wasn't ready. Not really. For all its power, Terra wasn't a fortress. It was a symbol, a throne, a relic, a dream carved into marble and steel. Dorn did everything he could to prepare, building defenses, reinforcing the palace, turning the surface of the world into a kill zone. But even then, it was a losing battle. The forces arrayed against Terra weren't just vast, they were furious. Horus had spent years gathering his armies, and by the time he arrived, he wasn't leading legions anymore. He was leading nightmares. The skies broke first. Massive void battles in orbit turned the heavens into graveyards. Ships the size of cities collided, burst into flame, rained debris onto the surface. Luna, the moon, was fought over like it was the last piece of high ground in the galaxy. Loyalist fleets tried desperately to hold back the tide, but Horus had numbers, momentum, and madness on his side. When the traitors made planetfall, they hit with the force of an extinction event. What followed wasn't just war, it was apocalypse. The siege of the Imperial Palace became a grinding, unending horror. Every level, every corridor, every trench soaked in blood and ash. Titans dueled in the ruins. Daemons boiled out of the warp, summoned by the word-bearers in foul rituals that twisted the sky itself. The Death Guard unleashed plagues that withered entire divisions. World Eaters tore through walls with their bare hands, screaming the name of Khorne. And above it all, Horus watched, silent, waiting, letting the pressure build for that final moment. And the defenders? They didn't break. They couldn't. The Blood Angels, led by Sanguinius, held the Eternity Gate even as their numbers dwindled. The Imperial Fists stood to the last man in some sections. The White Scars, the Sisters of Silence, the Adeptus Custodes, every single warrior knew this was it. There were no reinforcements coming, no retreats. This was the line that couldn't be crossed. If Terra fell, humanity fell with it. But there was a kind of hope in the madness. Reinforcements were coming, slowly, impossibly. Roboute Guilliman, Lionel Johnson, and others were pushing toward Terra with every ounce of strength they had left. And Horus knew it. He knew time was running out. That's why he did the unthinkable. He lowered the shields on his battle barge, the Vengeful Spirit. It was an invitation, a challenge, a chance for the Emperor to end it all, one way or another. The Emperor took it. Alongside Sanguinius and Rogal Dorn, he teleported aboard the ship. And what followed was the end of the heresy, in both the most literal and symbolic sense. Inside that twisted, hellish vessel, the past and future of the Imperium collided in the most tragic way possible. Sanguinius found Horus first, and fans still argue about what happened in that moment. Some say Sanguinius tried to reason with him, to reach whatever shred of brotherhood still lived inside the War Master. Others believe it was always doomed, that Horus had already fully given himself to chaos. Either way, it ended in death. Sanguinius was powerful, one of the finest of all the Primarchs, but Horus was now something more than a demigod. He crushed Sanguinius with his bare hands. The image of the angelic Primarch dying at the hands of his brother is one of the most haunting in all of Warhammer. Not just because of the brutality, but because of the loss of potential, the loss of hope. And then the Emperor arrived. No words can really capture what happened in that final battle. It wasn't just two powerful beings clashing. It was a metaphysical war, ideals against corruption, love against betrayal. The Emperor didn't want to kill Horus. Even after everything, he still loved him. That's the most painful part. He hesitated, and Horus didn't. He struck with all the fury and power of the gods who now walked beside him, and the Emperor, the most powerful psyker in human history, was nearly destroyed. Some say he died in that moment and was only kept alive by sheer will and the sacrifice of others. Some say he let it happen, believing there was no other way. But whatever the truth, it was the death of something sacred. Finally, when Horus showed no remorse, no hesitation, the Emperor unleashed his full power. The blow obliterated Horus so completely that not even his soul could escape. It was annihilation, an act of divine judgment, and the cost was nearly everything. When Dorn found the Emperor, he was broken, dying, barely clinging to life. They carried him back to the Golden Throne, a device never meant to be used like this, and hooked his shattered body to it. He's still there now, 10,000 years later, trapped between death and undeath, guiding humanity not as a man but as a symbol, a corpse god, on a throne of lies and sacrifice. The siege of Terra wasn't just the end of the heresy. It was the moment the Imperium as we know it was born. Not from hope or unity, but from desperation, from blood, from tragedy. The dream of the Great Crusade ended in fire and ash, and what rose from the ruins was something colder, harder, and infinitely more terrifying. And every time I read about it, every time I think of Sanguinius falling, of the Emperor hesitating, of Horus finally being destroyed, I feel that ache. Because no matter how grand the battles or how epic the scale, the heresy wasn't about armies, it was about people, about family. And in the end, that's what makes it so unforgettable. Horus didn't just die, he was erased, unmade. That final moment between him and the Emperor wasn't some cinematic duel of blades and lightning. It was a heartbreak played out on the most apocalyptic scale imaginable. You have to understand, the Emperor didn't want to kill Horus. Even after everything, the betrayal, the massacres, the death of Sanguinius, he still loved him. Horus wasn't just a traitor, he was his son, his first, his favorite. And when they finally stood face to face on the vengeful spirit, it wasn't just about the fate of the Imperium. It was about a father trying one last time to save his child, and realizing he couldn't. That hesitation is one of the most debated moments in all of Warhammer lore. Why did the Emperor hold back? Was it mercy? Hope? Guilt? Some say it was because he blamed himself for what Horus became, that if he had been more present, more open, more human, Horus wouldn't have fallen. Others argue it was tactical, that he was still looking for an alternative even as the battle raged. But whatever the reason, Horus saw it, and he used it. The War Master struck with all the power of the Chaos Gods behind him. His blade, his will, his rage, everything was focused into a single moment. And the Emperor, even at the height of his power, couldn't withstand it without consequence. He was wounded, fatally, some say, because of that 1 second of hesitation, because he couldn't bear to destroy the son he had once believed would save mankind. But in the end, there was no other way. When it became clear that Horus was gone, completely, irreversibly, the Emperor finally unleashed the full measure of his might. He obliterated Horus' body and soul, burning away every trace of his existence in a psychic act so violent it echoes through the warp even now. There was nothing left. Not even the gods could save him. That moment was the Emperor's ultimate act of love and judgment, and then he collapsed. The death of Horus didn't just mark the end of a war. It shattered the galaxy. With their leader gone and their momentum broken, the traitor legions began to fall apart. Some retreated in panic. Others fought on out of sheer rage. The cohesion they had under Horus, his charisma, his leadership, his vision, died with him. The warlords who remained weren't united by purpose anymore, only by hate and madness. And even that didn't last. In the years that followed, the traitor legions fractured. Some vanished into the Eye of Terror, seeking shelter in the hellish realms of the warp. There, they were twisted even further, becoming the Chaos Space Marines we know today, immortal, corrupted, driven by madness and the will of their dark patrons. Others tried to hold on to some version of what they once were, but without Horus, their cause had no center. The Sons of Horus themselves were a broken shell. Their legion, once the most feared in the galaxy, fell into infighting and disgrace. Eventually, they were torn apart from within, and what remained became the Black Legion under Abaddon, another story entirely. And what of the Loyalists? They didn't come out whole either. The Imperium was saved, technically. Terra still stood. The Emperor still lived in a way, but nothing was the same. The dream of the Great Crusade was dead. The Emperor, broken and silent, was entombed within the Golden Throne, a psychic beacon now, not a ruler. His voice gone, his guidance lost, and with him, the unity of the Imperium began to unravel. The legions that had once been the Emperor's finest were reshaped in fear of another heresy. Guilliman, returning after the war, implemented the Codex Astartes, splitting the legions into smaller chapters, limiting their power. Some agreed, others hated it. But the scars of the heresy were so deep that no one dared oppose it openly. The Adeptus Astartes became more isolated, more rigid. The Age of Heroes gave way to bureaucracy and paranoia, and the consequences didn't stop there. Psychers were now seen as dangerous liabilities. The warp was a threat, not a tool. The Emperor's dream of a rational, enlightened imperium was replaced with superstition and fanaticism. The ecclesiarchy rose in power, turning him into a literal god, worshipped not for his vision, but for his sacrifice. And while he may have never wanted that, the irony is that it worked. Faith held the imperium together when logic couldn't. Fear kept it alive when hope failed. But perhaps the most lasting consequence is this: the heresy never really ended. Not truly. 10,000 years later, the traitors still fight, the long war continues, chaos still whispers, and the Imperium, held together by duct tape and devotion, still reels from a betrayal that happened across millennia. Every purge, every crusade, every act of inquisitorial brutality has its roots in that moment, when the Emperor struck down his favorite son and in doing so lost himself. I've heard fans argue that Horus could have been saved, that the Emperor should have tried harder or sooner, that the other Primarchs should have stepped in, that the heresy could have been avoided. And maybe they're right. Maybe a single conversation, a different tone, a better understanding could have changed everything. But in the grimdark universe of Warhammer, what-ifs don't matter. Only what is. And what is a galaxy still bleeding from that final strike. Horus is gone. The Emperor is entombed, and we are all living in the ruins of their last conversation. The Horus Heresy isn't just a chapter in a rulebook. It's the spine of Warhammer 40k. Everything we know about this universe today, from the grimdark horror of the Imperium to the twisted mockeries of the Chaos Legions, traces back to this one, impossible fracture. And yet, for all its cataclysmic scope, for all the gods and wars and world-shattering betrayals, it still feels personal. That's what keeps pulling us back. Because at its heart, the heresy wasn't about the galaxy. It was about people, about choices, regret, pride, love, and failure. You can look at it like a cautionary tale of what happens when vision outpaces compassion, when ambition outruns understanding. The Emperor had a dream, sure, but he didn't share it. He built his empire on silence, on control, and on the backs of sons who never really got to be people. He created the Primarchs to be tools, weapons, symbols. And in doing so, maybe he forgot they had hearts, egos, emotions. Horus wasn't just a war master. He was a child trying to live up to the expectations of a god who wouldn't speak plainly. And when he finally broke, he didn't fall alone. He dragged half the stars down with him. Some fans say the Emperor is the real villain, that he knew what would happen and let it play out anyway, because some part of him believed it was necessary. That Terra had to burn for humanity to evolve. Others say it was Horus, plain and simple, that no matter the pain or the pressure, he chose to side with chaos. That millions have carried heavier burdens without betraying everything they stood for. And then there are the tragic takes, the ones that paint everyone as victims of circumstance. The Emperor, Horus, the Primarchs, the Imperium itself, all swept up in a cycle of failure that was set in motion long before the first shot was fired. There's a kind of beauty in that ambiguity. No clean answers, no clear heroes. Just a galaxy filled with broken people trying to make sense of a broken legacy. That's what keeps this story alive, even after so many years. The books, the fan theories, the debates, they're not just about who killed who or which legion was stronger. They're about why it happened, what it means, whether things could have gone differently, and whether the galaxy would be better or worse if they had. Some theorists go deep into the idea of predestination, that Horus was always going to fall, that the Chaos Gods were always going to twist someone, and Horus was just the most likely target. Others point to Lorgar, saying he was the real origin, that his secret worship, his bitterness, planted the seeds of everything. And then there's the idea that the heresy wasn't a failure. It was a necessary step, that without it, the Imperium would have become something even more monstrous, unchecked by any internal rebellion. A terrifying thought, but in this universe, not impossible. And maybe that's the real genius of the Horus Heresy. It reflects us, our own fears about power, betrayal, leadership, and love. We see ourselves in it, even if we're not demigod generals or godlike rulers, because we know what it's like to feel abandoned, to question loyalty, to see something beautiful twisted into something cruel. The heresy just amplifies that to galactic proportions and gives us bolters and battle barges to go with it. In modern Warhammer culture, the heresy isn't just history, it's the heartbeat. Fans dive into the novels, the audio dramas, the artwork with a kind of reverence. We know how it ends, sure, but we still reread False Gods or The First Heretic just to feel that tension all over again. We still argue over whether Angron could have been saved, or if Magnus really did do anything wrong. We build armies themed around Isstvan. We paint Sons of Horus with that sickly green just to channel the tragedy. It's not just lore, it's mythology. It's our version of a space-age Iliad. And the coolest part? The story still isn't finished. The Siege of Terra novels are unpacking those final hours moment by moment, showing us new angles, new heartbreaks, new questions. We know the ending. But the journey to get there is still unfolding, and every chapter brings another perspective, another layer of meaning. It keeps evolving, just like our understanding of it. So yeah, maybe that's why we keep coming back, because the heresy isn't just something that happened. It's something we feel. It's the moment the Warhammer universe stopped being a setting and became a tragedy. If this breakdown of the Horus Heresy gave you something to think about, or even just reminded you why you love this universe as much as I do, don't forget to hit that like button, drop a comment with your own heresy theories, and subscribe for more deep dives into the grimdark. There's still so much to explore. And trust me, when it comes to Warhammer, the past is never really dead. It's just waiting to rise again.